No? So CPF list is really a list of the rules. No? This is a PF firewall front end for the OSX 10.7. So ang naangari is pure on the list of all roles. Another is the ice floor. So si ice floor, this is also a front end for the OSX 10.7 and 10.10. No? So, mora iyang gamit anini ice floor. Then, another would be si Moros. No? Ani si Moros. So, Moros is most popular front end, which is naani siya feature, naa siya lethal, then naa siya basic and pro. No? So, let's have to try sa iyahang feature. Tanaw na to, si Moros. Okay? Okay? So, this is the Moros, no? And the volume. Okay? So, nani siya diri sa iyahang rule. And, dili ta kasulod kayo ani ha. So, ayaw lang mo uguan nga. Mayroon ka, ma'am, di lagi kita kasulod. Oh, yes. Kita. So, i-try na to. Yun, kanobi. Si Moros the firewall. Okay, so, kani, no? Nadiha. At, okay, so, ni-prevail siya. Na siya streamline diri. Okay, dara. No? So, na siya feature, which is the light, the basic, and the Moros Pro. So, if you're going to look at on the light, so light is free ni siya, no? That is for the front end and free. While si basic o si pro is dili na siya free. Another is if you're going to look at gamay siya og feature diri. So ang pinakadaghan og feature is the si pro, no? So mo na pinakadaghan feature diri si pro because bayranan siya. Okay. Kani Shimoros is free lang na siya if you're going to. So na siya license ana ang inig gamit na to ani na ni siya license. Okay. So another is this is the Lethal Snatch 3, no? So si Lethal Snatch 3 is or Lethal Snatch that is a very good application based. So application based sad ni iya hangari in a firewall designed and it has much easier to understand interface rather than other. But this is not free. So, no? So, na may makita diri is dili siya free. Okay. So, inikuan pabayron ta, no? Download and subay. Okay. So, that's the end of the Linux and the Mac. No? Okay. So, ang last is for the firewall on the router, no? So, kana siya akong paisurahon ana. Another is the hardware, no? That is network based and the F-Sense. Okay? So, pa-demo gid ni nako kay wala man gyud tay router na makita, no? Dili man siya, di man ta connected ron. Okay?
The first and obvious place to have a network-based firewall is on your router. Some of the high-end routers may come with some good firewall functionality, and the low-end routers that you buy may have limited or no firewall functionality at all. One of the reasons for using custom firmware that we went through, like OpenWRT and DDWRT on routers, is to get access to a more configurable firewall. And I'm talking about IP tables here. We see here OpenWRT using our friend IP tables, which we discussed already in the video on Linux host firewalls. So OpenWRT uses IP tables. And here we have DDWRT also using IP tables. We will use DDWRT to discuss and demonstrate router-based network firewalls during this video. Routers like this with custom firmware may provide you with enough firewall functionality for your needs, but are generally configurable mostly if you want most of the power out of them via the command line. Here is what you can do with the GUI in DDWRT. It provides some limited functionality to enable and disable IP tables. And if you go down here, you can see some additional functionality. You can add additional filters, proxy, cookies, Java applets, ActiveX out of the traffic, which is kind of useful, but obviously won't work with encryption as it doesn't break the encryption, and we want to use encryption all the time anyway, so it really limits that. You've got some WAN blocking that you can do here, which again is pretty limited, and you've got some brute force protection. There's a connection warning notifier where you can get sent messages about certain events, which is kind of useful, and you've also got logging. You can set the log level, low, medium, or high, and then whether you want to enable or disable that logging for that particular chain, the chains which we have gone through, so drop, reject, and accept. All of this is configurable normally through IP tables. This is just a GUI to simplify the process. In the example of DDWRT, if you want to edit your firewall any more than that, or IP tables, you have the option of coming to administration and then commands, and then you can enter essentially IP table commands here and then save those commands, and those commands will run when you start the router. Or alternatively, of course, you can log into the router via SSH and do IP tables. You will, of course, need to get to grips with IP tables in order to do that. And do make sure you don't lock yourself out of the administrative interfaces when you're fiddling with IP tables. That will be a problem. And for DDWRT, as that's what we're demoing here, you can see an example of some of the commands that you can put into this box here, which is supplied by DDWRT, just some examples, and there's also a page on how to use IP tables in combination with DDWRT. And other custom router firmware will be similar, as of course IP tables is the same on all of them. If you're looking for a GUI for IP tables on your router, you could look at using Firewall Builder, which is a third-party firewall GUI that you would run on a separate machine, a separate PC or device, which will manage the IP table rules on the router, and it does it remotely via SSH, and it supports Mac, Windows, and Linux. This page here gives you some more information of how to use it with DDWRT, and this is the home page for Firewall Builder. Download, install it, and you'll find it much easier to configure your firewall than perhaps using IP tables if you're not familiar with it. There's also videos here on how to use it. So that's an option as well for you. If you saw the video on host-based Linux firewalls, I also mentioned some other GUIs for IP tables, but this one in particular works with DDWRT well.
Okay, so let's proceed for the next. Second to the last video on the router.
If you want more functionality, power, and ease of configuration through a GUI, then you need to look at a dedicated hardware or a dedicated virtual network firewall. You could use an old PC or laptop if you have one of those hanging around and install it on that, but it will need to be powerful enough, or you can buy a relatively cheap piece of hardware in order to put the firewall on. If you want to go the dedicated hardware route, if you see here, I do recommend these guys. I have no affiliation with them, but I recommend their products. And if you're looking for a PC specifically for routing and firewalling, if we go here, you can see the APU devices, and you can choose based on how powerful you want to go. Here we have a 4 gig board, which you can look at here. This is the APU platform. These are designed to be routers and firewalls and have multiple network cards, as you saw, which you want and need if you want to create distinct, different routable networks, if you don't want to use just VLANs. With hardware like this, the firewall would act as the router as well as the firewall, so you wouldn't necessarily need a separate router and firewall for your network. This could replace your router or act as your router as well. But if you like, you could have a separate router and a separate firewall. That could be useful depending on your configuration, and it could give you more isolation depending on what it is you're trying to do. You would probably need a modem or something that enables you to connect to the internet, as well as a firewall stroke router. And this is the sort of money that you're going to pay for these particular devices. So not too bad, ranging from $100 or so to $130 US dollars, and you can buy cases as well for them. Nice, simple, powerful little PC to be a dedicated firewall. If you want to go the open source hardware route to prevent interdiction, these guys offer open source hardware. I haven't used them before though, or you could search around for other open source hardware suppliers.
Okay, so the last one.
As for what network firewall I would recommend, the first one is pfSense, which you can download from this site here, which looks like this. pfSense is a free open source firewall router software distribution based on FreeBSD. Unlike the custom router firmware, which we went through already, that is installed on routers, pfSense is installed on a computer, a PC, the sort of hardware that I've just gone through and just shown you. This is installed on that to make a dedicated firewall stroke router for a network. pfSense is based on the PF firewall, which we discussed already, which you know is for Mac OS X and BSD. pfSense is now much more than PF. As you can see, it has a nice interface and has many features. pfSense is a more powerful firewall and router than what you will get with DDWRT or OpenWRT, as they are pretty much just IP tables. And I highly recommend this pfSense. It has features usually found only in expensive commercial firewalls you'd have to pay quite a lot of money for. pfSense could be used as a firewall and router in combination. It can be used as a DHCP server, pretty much all of the things that you would expect from a router and what will be running on your router now, like DNS server. But this also has things like you can install intrusion detection, intrusion prevention, like Snort. It can be used to isolate your network, so you can have trusted and untrusted devices. You can have virtual LANs, and it can act as a VPN client or a VPN server. In fact, it has many security features and services, and you can add more custom services to it as well. It works very well as a VPN client for establishing VPNs out of your network for privacy, which we discuss in its own section. So you could essentially have all of your traffic or some of your traffic going via a VPN. And you can customize it with customization. For example, you could put Tor on it. So you can make all of your traffic Torified via the firewall. They do have their own hardware options, which will make it easier for you to get it up and running, but they are actually quite expensive. If we look down here, you can click on more details. And you can see for the very basic, we're talking bottom price is $299, and that only has a WAN and a LAN, which is exactly why I showed you that other hardware, which gives you much more for your money. It is installed like any other operating system. Download the ISO and install it. It's free. Check out this link here to get it. And as I've shown you, this is what it looks like here. So system, configuring your interfaces, firewall, your rules, all the various services that you would expect that I've talked about. We mentioned the VPN client, VPN server, lots of ways of looking at the status, diagnostic, etc. So a fully featured free firewall. There is actually another fork of pfSense that is supposed to be more open source, but I haven't actually used that, and that's this OPNsense. So if you're into the whole open source thing, you may prefer this as an option over pfSense. Another popular firewall, similar in its features to pfSense, is Smoothwall, and there is a free open source version, which is the Express option, which you can see here, and then there is the commercial version, which is a paid for version. This can be downloaded and installed on a PC, much the same as pfSense. Also of note is this one, which is VYOS. This is more of a techie's choice router firewall. It's a unified base in the style of hardware routers like Cisco. So if you're a network engineer and you're used to Cisco, you'll be more familiar with this sort of a firewall. It can run as a virtual appliance on KVM, Zen, VMware, etc. There is a VM OVA file that you can download if you want to test it out, and you'll find that this runs very fast. And of course, we have just been talking there all about hardware firewalls as your network firewall. Instead of using hardware, you can actually use a virtual machine. Obviously, the virtual machine needs to be sat on hardware, and that hardware needs to be extremely fast, which will host a network-based firewall. You could use a Zen server for that, but like I said, the hardware would need to be quite a beast for it to support a router and a firewall, plus all of the other virtualization that you might be running on it. But that is an option. Is it worth having a network-based firewall? Well, on a home network, as we know, network address translation or NAT, because of that, there is no need for inbound from the internet to the LAN to be filtered or blocked using a firewall, because NAT blocks it. Inbound filtering not required. But if you install an IDS or an IPS, intrusion detection system, intrusion prevention system like Snort, which you can do, for example, on pfSense, you can block inbound attacks that match certain attack signatures. So that's a use case for it. Outbound filtering is a viable security control for a network firewall. You could use this to lock down just the ports that you intend to use, like maybe you just surf the web, use Tor, VPNs and email, or whatever services you want. You would enable those, allow those, and block the rest. certain devices that you don't want to use certain ports or services, you could block. You could, for example, force DNS to only go to the DNS servers that you want it to go to for privacy. You could even force DNS over VPN so that you get real privacy using a network-based firewall. You could block IPv6 at the firewall so that you can prevent VPN leakage at the network layer instead of on your host. You can block traffic that you don't like say, for example, you don't want people using torrents on your network. You can do cool things like limit bandwidth for some users on your network. Maybe you have a network user that streams videos and it's clogging up your network. You could reduce their bandwidth so other people can use the network. Features like that are available in routers, so it's not just exclusive to firewalls. There is one reason why you might want to use a firewall. A more dedicated device will have more power. As you'll probably know already now, a network firewall won't help if internal malware uses ports you already have open, which is usually port 80 and 443. So it doesn't protect you against malware or adversaries that are already on your network or are attempting to gain a foothold through a vulnerability to create a reverse shell back to them, because it will just often use the web ports and ports that you already have open. So that outbound filtering that the firewall does is a weak protection against those sorts of attacks. However, if you're using an application firewall or you proxy the traffic, which you can do with these high-end dedicated devices and custom router firmware, pfSense, for example, does it, the results could be better for blocking the traffic because you can do some forms of deep packet inspection. The network firewall can be used to help monitor and log the network traffic. You can then see what might or might not be trying to attack you and maybe change what you're doing in order to counter that. This can be done with just a good router though, so it's not a service that just firewalls provide, but a dedicated firewall is just often more functional for logging and monitoring. For example, DDWRT versus pfSense. pfSense is better for logging and monitoring. A large use case for a network firewall is to help in the creation of network isolation, probably in combination with your switch, which we will discuss next. If you have a high need for security, privacy, and anonymity, a firewall will aid in that network isolation, and that will be useful for you. You can potentially do network isolation with just a good router that has some switch capability, but a dedicated firewall like pfSense can make things easier because you can use its functionality. So that's network firewalls, and we're going to talk more about network isolation next.
Okay, so that's the end of our show, no? So, wala ang pagpa-show sa